Hi everyone, Steve Wise here, President and Founder of Mental Fitness LLC. Today I would like to talk about Addiction 101. Now, I am doing this pretty much off the top of my head and I'm going to try to do it in about 20 minutes. I, for reference, used to work in methadone once I graduated with my master's in social work, and I worked there for about 2.5 years. Then I worked in private practice, and largely early on in my career, I worked with a caseload that was about half people taking Suboxone, which is considered medicated assisted treatment. From that, I learned everything I could about addiction. Now, that has also been probably about 5 years ago since I've really felt like I was on top of my game and knew my stuff. So it is probably true that I have forgotten at this point as much as I've retained. However, I still think that I qualify as an addiction expert. And what I want to do is take about the next 19 minutes and share about as much as I can in that time with you to help you become knowledgeable in the field of addiction as well. With that, let's go. So, there's a lot of topics I want to cover, and 19 minutes is probably ambitious, so this might be a part 1 and part 2. But let's talk about the history of addiction, okay? So the history of addiction starts off with a study that is very important. And the original study, to my knowledge, and again, you'd have to fact check me on some of this just because some of the details aren't going to be exact, but you'll get the point. The original kind of history of addiction starts with a rat in a box, and if you give the rat a choice between cocaine or cheese, it's going to get addicted to cocaine. And then if you say, Mr. Rat, you only get one choice today, what are you going to choose? Your food, your cheese, your life-sustaining, dopamine-producing food, or your cocaine, which gives you more dopamine than that, it's going to choose the drug every time until the rat dies. That makes the argument that drugs are powerful hooks, okay? So that happened around, let's say 1900. Before 1900, and even up past 1900, the first storyline of about 3, I would say, the first storyline in addiction is that if you are addicted, you are weak. It is a moral character failure, and it is strongly stigmatized. And the treatment for that was like, let's throw them in asylum. And the drugs that existed, either medical or not, were kind of cocktails. And there wasn't really a whole lot of regulation or classification. Again, the original Coca-Cola had cocaine in it. Heroin was invented by Bayer. That's probably important to know. It wasn't until kind of the 1900s that we start to see some things become regulated. But again, the first storyline of addiction is the moral failure. Like, you are responsible for becoming addicted, and we really kind of blame the person. So, the next storyline in addiction, the next major storyline, is what I'm going to call the medicalization of treatment, and it's kind of the broken brain story, right? So, in the 1990s, Prozac is super popular, and I believe that the research efficacy of Prozac was probably dubious at best. Prozac and other SSRIs do have sometimes what's known as a black box warning, and that is that there's a chance that taking this medication could increase suicidal thoughts. And sometimes people misconstrue that and they think, oh my gosh, I'm already kind of depressed. I don't want to take something that might cause me even more suicidal thoughts. But the important thing to note there is, even though it might cause suicidal thoughts in some, the help it does tends to be many, many folds greater than the potential risk. So it is still worth it for someone struggling with depression to take an antidepressant. Anywho, 1990s, Prozac comes out, Prozac Nation. The story starts to shift, and the shift becomes now, it's not you, a character failing, it's your brain. It's your brain that lacks serotonin, and this medication will help correct that. And so that storyline gets picked up and accepted as truth. So So in some ways that destigmatized things, because people are like, oh, I'm not just, a moral failure. I have different brain levels of chemicals in my brain, and so it's not me, it's my brain. And so in some ways that was a progressive step. And in many ways it was also oversold, not greatly correct in many cases, because now what I'm going to call the third story of addiction is it's not the drug, it's the cage. It's not the person, it's the cage. It's not the brain, it's the cage. It's not the cage so much as it's the person's environment. The challenge of looking at someone's environment is it's very hard to study. It's very nuanced to see, how does one's environment affect the person. But for me, that is the most accurate way of looking at things. And that's where we're at right now, where we're looking at addiction as a bonding issue. That if people don't have connections to other purpose, to nature, to status and respect, to a secure, to security, to hope, to others, to a tribe, that gives them acceptance and belonging, if they lack those connections, then they might bond with drugs. If they're grieving, they might bond with drugs, right? So Johann Hari, in my opinion, has pioneered this kind of bonding model of addiction. He is not a psychiatrist or even a psychologist. He's a journalist, but he's also my hero. And I think that's where we need to head. We need to look at this with more truth and nuance and not look at the oversimplified stories of it's your fault, it's a character failing, or it's just this broken brain syndrome that a for-profit medication, obviously there's a huge angle there, can help solve. And to really look at our environment and are we living a natural life, or is our unnatural environment in many ways causing us feelings of depression? So next on my list, the schedule system. Again, I'm kind of throwing everything at you here with this video. I'm doing this at 8:30 in the morning with minimal caffeine and just wanting to get as much out there as I can. Alex, we will organize this, but let's get all the content out there. The schedule system. There are, to my knowledge, 5 levels of scheduling drugs. Level 1 includes drugs with basically no medical value and that are very dangerous. Level 5 is drugs that have medical value and are not very dangerous, and all kinds of in between. So level 1 would be heroin, very dangerous. Diamorphine actually is the medical form of heroin, but heroin itself, Schedule 1, highly regulated, highly dangerous. LSD, Schedule 1. Marijuana on a federal level, still Schedule 1. Legal in some states, still Schedule 1 on the federal level, whatever. Schedule 2 would be methadone. Schedule 3 would be Suboxone, and we'll talk in a lot more depth about those. And then there are various medications in the 4 or 5 lists. Your antidepressants, your benzos are a little riskier than your standard kind of SSRI. And we'll talk about all of that, but you should know that there is a classification that exists, and it's called the schedule system. So when we think about marijuana and CBD, I have this next on my list. I used to know so much about this, the pros and cons of legalization versus recreation, which is the same thing, legalizing recreational use, and CBD. CBD seems to me to be oversold. I'm sure it does have some medical properties, but I think they're oversold. Marijuana is legal in a lot of states now. I've lost count how many, have it legalized for medical versus legal. It's legal in New Jersey and Ohio. It's legal for medical purposes here in Pennsylvania, which means you need a medical card. The challenge with getting a medical card is some argue that adds a layer of protection. I argue that you can get a medical card for any reason whatsoever, and so it's just kind of a hassle. Some argue that we should, if marijuana is truly medical, have insurance cover it. Interesting argument. Right now it is not covered by insurance, which makes it not super accessible. So the challenge with marijuana and alcohol is largely this. 20% of people who consume marijuana buy 80% of the product. The exact same thing can be said for alcohol. 20% of people who buy all of the alcohol, 20% of people who buy 80% of the alcohol. So what that means is basically like we are selling, like beer advertisers advertise to like the recreational user, and they all have their very unique marketing lane. Like Corona's like the beach, and Bud Light is like the football tailgate, and Miller Lite is taste, and Coors Light is actually just cold. They found a lane in cold. It's marketing genius. But anyways, the challenge here is that most people like light beer. We'll talk about that when we get to the iron law of prohibition. But the reality is when you sell a product, you are typically selling the majority of the product to the people who are addicted to it. 20% of people who buy alcohol or marijuana consume 80% of the product. That's something you should know. When we look at MAT, when I talk about MAT or MAUD, MAT stands for medicated assisted treatment. So when we came up with the 12 steps, which I'll talk about more about, that was around 1939, and it came out by Dr. Bob and Bill Wilson. And the 12 steps are a very abstinence-based model. It's based on the surrender to win concept. Like, we admit we are powerless to our addictions, that our lives have become unmanageable. Now, there's a we concept to that is very valuable because it gets people to feel part of a community, and that's more healing than the 12 steps themselves. The powerlessness part, I don't love, but what they're trying to say is we're not going to try to fight to control our drug use anymore. It's the surrender to win concept. Like, I'm going to stop fighting, stop using entirely, commit to abstinence, and that will be how I win this fight against addiction. Now, the 12 steps have historically kind of hated on people taking medication-assisted treatment. Even though their founders, Dr. Bob and Bill Wilson, Dr. Bob said at one point, man, I wish there was medications that could help people stop using. And in 1939, we didn't have them. But now we do. So there are various types of medication-assisted treatment. And they are methadone, Suboxone, naltrexone, Vivitrol, naloxone, Subucade, and Antabuse. So I'm gonna run through each one here. Methadone is a full opioid agonist. Okay, so an agonist is when you think about turning a key into a lock. An agonist, the more you take, the more it turns the key. So with methadone, the average dose is about 80 milligrams. I've seen people take over 200, maybe sometimes an initiation dose is 30 milligrams. But basically with methadone, the more you take, the more effect you get. Methadone, for reference, is an opiate that is long lasting. So people take methadone because unlike other opiates that have like a quick short half-life, which gives you a quick high and then a quick drop, where people have to use heroin 4 or 5 times a day to kind of not go into withdrawal. Methadone can be taken just once a day because it has a 24 to 36 hour half-life, I believe. Suboxone works the exact same way. It is about a 37-hour half-life. So again, one dose doesn't get you high, but also gives you mercy from withdrawal throughout the entire day, which lets people then restore functioning in their lives. Also, when you take methadone, because you put a key into the receptor, we'll talk more about this in the pharmacology section, but when you put a key into the receptor, if you try to take another opiate on top of methadone, you'd have to take a lot of opiate to feel an effect beyond the methadone, because the methadone is in that receptor. You can't put a key into a key. You can't put a key into a lock that already has a key in it, right? So methadone has this kind of blocking agent in the sense that, like, the more methadone you take, you'd have to use an extreme amount of heroin or other opiates to feel something on top of that, which kind of makes it pointless to do. So the more methadone you take, the less likely you are to use illicit opiates, because it makes it harder to override. The con of that, if you are really determined to override it and you take a ton of heroin plus a ton of methadone, is a quick script to die. They're both central nervous system depressants, and double downers the quickest way to kill yourself, so, risky there. So methadone was like the gold standard for Medicaid-assisted treatment until we came up with Subutex and Suboxone. Subutex, as opposed to Suboxone, is just straight buprenorphine. Okay, so Subutex is the brand name, buprenorphine is the generic name. Suboxone is buprenorphine plus naloxone. Subutex is very much like methadone, in that it has no quote-unquote... Subutex is not like methadone. Subutex and Suboxone are partial agonists. Okay, so what that means is when you put a key in a lock and you turn it, Subutex and Suboxone will only kind of turn it halfway. At some point, usually around 16 milligrams, there's a diminishing return where if you take more, you're not going to get any kind of higher from it. And that is one of the pros of Subutex or Suboxone. With Suboxone, however, they took buprenorphine plus naloxone. Naloxone is what we use when someone gets Narcan. It sucks all of the opiates out of someone's receptors, and if their receptors are overwhelmed and they're overdosing, that will save lives. So naloxone is the Narcan shot. Suboxone has a combination of Subutex, 4 parts, and naloxone, 1 part, to make Suboxone. Now, how this is supposed to work, and I'm not sure it really does work this way, but it's supposed to work that if you shoot Subutex, you use it intravenously, you can kind of break its extended release half-life and feel a high similar to heroin and other opiates. However, because the naloxone was added to the buprenorphine to make Suboxone, if you use intravenously, Suboxone, the naloxone will kick in and you will feel withdrawal. At the same time, here's the trick with all of these. If somebody's using heroin and they're going through withdrawal, they can immediately take methadone. They cannot immediately take Suboxone because if you take Suboxone too soon after having used, the naloxone will kick in and you'll put yourself into withdrawal. You kind of have to be in withdrawal to initiate Suboxone, or you'll put yourself into withdrawal. So it's a little trickier to initiate someone on Suboxone than it is methadone. Then there's also naltrexone, or the Vivitrol shot. So the Vivitrol shot is wonderful. When people go to jail, I would vote that we should make naltrexone and the Vivitrol shot, which is the same thing, generic brand name, accessible to everybody who leaves jail. 70% of people in jail are addicted to opiates when they go there. And when they come out of jail, is a particularly vulnerable time, because let's just say you went to jail for 60 days and for the first 2 weeks you were in withdrawal, but now you've stopped using, and the first couple weeks you were in withdrawal, but you went through that in jail and now you're clean. But we release people from jail right back into their home environments. Their tolerance is down and they go right back into their home environments. They try to use what they're used to using and they die. Because if you use what you're used to using after your tolerance falls, it's a quick script for death, and we see that a lot, unfortunately. The Vivitrol shot is wonderful because it's a shot that you can get intravenously, intramuscularly into usually the glute, and it lasts for a month, and it's just the blocking agent. So there's no addiction risk for Vivitrol. There is for methadone and Suboxone. You can't just stop taking them because they're either an agonist or a partial agonist. Now, the naltrexone shot, the Vivitrol shot, is a zero agonist. It's like with methadone, if you put the key in the receptor, you turn it all the way with methadone. The more you take, the more it turns. With Suboxone, it only turns a halfway. It has a ceiling. It hits a ceiling at about 16 milligrams. You double the dose, it really doesn't give you much more of an effect. Naltrexone is very much like you put a key in a lock and you break off the key in there. It still has the blocking effect, but it doesn't turn the key at all. So it'll block other opiates if you try to use them because there's a key in there, but it's not turning the key at all to give you any agonist positive effect. With that, I'm going to pause the video here and I'm going to make part 2. It is going to be way longer than I anticipated. I don't know why. I thought it'd be like 20 minutes. It's probably going to be well closer to an hour because I'm not even probably like fifth of the way through this. But I'm gonna pause and see if I can pick up right now or if I can pick up later. But this is gonna be YouTube video part 1.